The hearing room hummed with the usual tension of political theater papers shuffling, pens scratching, cameras clicking like restless insects. But then it cut sharp. Senator Ron Johnson leaned forward, his smirk widening, his voice laced with the smugness of someone who thought the stage belonged only to him. With calculated cruelty, he mocked Jasmine Crockett's background, weaving condescension into every syllable. It wasn't just words, it was dismissal, the kind of sneer meant to reduce a life of grit and service into a punchline. The chamber reacted instantly. A collective gasp rippled like a sudden gust of wind through the room. Some leaned in closer. Others froze. Reporters' pens scratched faster across their notebooks, as if sensing history was slipping into their margins. The camera zoomed tighter, capturing every twitch of Johnson's grin, every flicker of Crockett's eyes. This wasn't policy debate anymore. This was something raw. And there she sat. Jasmine Crockett, still as stone, her face carved in calm composure. Not a flinch, not a frown. Just eyes steady, posture unyielding. The silence around her wasn't weakness. It was control. Power folded neatly into patience. Where Johnson thought he had drawn blood, he had only revealed his own insecurity. The room became divided in real time. On one side, quiet nods from those who delighted in the senator's jab, faces smirking in chorus with him. On the other, those who held their breath, waiting, knowing that Crockett wasn't a woman to be belittled without consequence. Even the anchors at the press table shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This wasn't routine sparring, it was the clash of two worlds. Johnson's laughter was the sound of entitlement echoing from centuries past. Crockett's silence was the weight of generations waiting to be heard. Every eye in the chamber knew the pause would not last forever. Her stillness wasn't surrender, it was the coiling of something sharper, truer, something that would not just answer a taunt, but cut through it, leaving its originator exposed. The air thickened. The moment stretched. And just as Johnson reclined, satisfied in his mockery, the stage was set. But what happened next would leave a U.S. senator storming out of his own. Hearing Ron Johnson's smirk wasn't an accident. It was the same smirk that had carried him through years of hearings, debates, and cable news soundbites. He had built a reputation on mockery and turning serious questions into jokes, on belittling progressives with sarcastic barbs, on leaning into the theater of derision. For Johnson, dominance was never about facts or fairness. It was about swagger, about proving that in a room full of microphones. His voice would always come out louder, sharper, and more dismissive. And on this day, in that chamber, he believed the script was his to write. A senator with years of power under his belt, cameras at the ready, an audience split but familiar, he expected his jab at Jasmine Crockett's background to land as just another viral moment in his arsenal of mockery. He thought the smirk would linger, the insult would stand, and the clip would circulate as proof that he, once again, had put a progressive in their place. But Crockett was not just another target. She was not a voice to be drowned out by volume or sarcasm. She was the embodiment of a new force, steady, deliberate, unshaken. Where Johnson built his brand on chaos, she built hers on clarity. Where he thrived in cutting others down, she rose by standing unflinching in the face of attack. Crockett's presence in that chamber was larger than the seat she occupied. She carried with her the voices of communities that had been silenced, mocked, and pushed aside for generations. Her calm was not passivity. It was the discipline of someone who had faced louder storms and sharper dismissals long before. Stepping into Congress, her silence was not weakness. It was the sound of restraint sharpening into something stronger, and that contrast, laid bare on live television, raised the stakes far beyond one Senate hearing. This wasn't about Ron Johnson's smirk. It wasn't even about Jasmine Crockett's response. It was about something bigger, something pressing on the conscience of the nation, whose story would America choose to validate. Would it be the story of arrogance of those who smirked their way through history, mocking the very idea of progress, dismissing the people who demand to be heard? Or would it be the story of dignity of those who refuse to bow to ridicule, who hold their ground with composure, who prove that calm in the face of insult is a power far greater than noise? Every camera angle, every reporter's note, Every gasp in that chamber carried the same realization. This wasn't just a spat between two politicians. This was a reckoning. The stakes weren't confined to that room. They stretched into living rooms, classrooms, and timelines across America. Millions would soon see the clip. Millions would weigh the contrast for themselves. And in that choice, mockery or dignity, the heart of America's future voice would be tested. The silence before Crockett's answer was no longer just silence. It was suspense. It was history coiling before it snapped. It was the moment before a reckoning. This wasn't just a spat. It was a reckoning on live television. Asterisk. Ron Johnson's career was forged in the fire of America's political upheaval. He wasn't a polished statesman or a careful tactician. He was a product of the Tea Party wave. The uprising that thrived on anger, disruption, and the promise to smash the so-called establishment. That moment gave Johnson his stage. He styled himself as the voice of the forgotten man, the outsider willing to bulldoze tradition. But beneath the populist gloss lay a style that would become his trademark. Mocking, dismissive, and unrelentingly condescending. When Donald Trump rose, Johnson didn't hesitate to align himself with the new power center. Trump's brand of politics, loud, combative, disdainful of opponents, fit neatly into Johnson's own instincts. He became a loyal soldier, repeating talking points, amplifying grievances, and leaning harder into culture war skirmishes. From pandemic controversies to voting rights debates, he built a public persona not on bridging divides, but on ridiculing those who dared challenge him. His smirk became his weapon, his sarcasm his shield. Time and again, Johnson leaned into that posture. When asked about systemic inequities, he brushed them off with jokes. When women, particularly women of color, raised questions about representation or justice, he defaulted to patronizing responses. He wasn't interested in engagement. He was interested in domination. In hearings, his voice rose not to debate but to drown out. In interviews, his quips weren't answers but dismissals. And to his base, that defiance played well. The louder he mocked, the more airtime he won. The more applause he harvested from those who believed disruption itself was proof of strength. But that very style came with a darker record. Moments that revealed just how calculated his condescension could be. Reporters recalled instances where his jokes about women's perspectives left entire panels bristling. Community advocates remembered hearings where he reduced concerns about marginalized groups to talking points or outright sneers. Johnson thrived on those clashes, seeing them not as missteps, but as trophies, evidence that he had rattled the so-called elites to his critics. It was never just banter. It was a performance of power, a reminder of who got to define the terms of debate. Johnson wore arrogance like armor, cloaking it in the authority of his office. He projected certainty even when facts were thin, mocked opponents even when their arguments were rooted in lived truth. His smirk wasn't just an expression. It was a message. I hold the mic. I set the stage. And I'll laugh at you while doing it. That was the essence of Johnson, as antagonist. The villainy was not loud in the comic book sense, but insidious in its smugness. He embodied the type of politician who believed authority entitled him to condescension, who believed his sneer was stronger than someone else's testimony, who treated public service as a platform for ridicule rather than responsibility, and yet arrogance has a shelf life. Mockery can only stretch so far before it begins to curdle. When every question is answered with derision, when every opponent is treated as laughable, the audience begins to see the cracks. Authority disguised as arrogance risks exposing itself for what it truly is. Fragility hiding behind noise. That is where the stage was set in the clash with Jasmine Crockett. Johnson walked into that hearing with the same toolkit he had used for years, the smirk, the mock, the tone dripping with dismissal. He thought the playbook would work again. He thought his sneer would overshadow her voice the way it had overshadowed so many others. But what he underestimated was the weight of silence. The sharpness of composure, the fact that mockery only lands when the other side plays along. Crockett didn't play along. She didn't flinch, didn't rise to his bait, didn't hand him the performance he wanted. And in that refusal, Johnson's style began to wobble. Because arrogance thrives on chaos. But arrogance collapses in the face of calm. The moment was bigger than one clash of personalities. It was a story of two political worlds colliding, one that thrived on sneers and one that refused to be defined by them. Johnson's career arc had brought him here, to this stage, to this confrontation. But history has a way of turning smirks into symbols, of exposing what once felt untouchable. And for Ron Johnson, the man who made mockery his brand, the danger was clear. Even the sharpest sneer can shatter when silence meets it head-on. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the bright lights of Washington, nor in the spotlight of televised hearings. It begins in Texas courtrooms, where the air was thick with tension, where prosecutors bore down with authority, and where young attorneys had to fight not just for their clients, but for their very right to be heard. Crockett was forged in that crucible. Every motion she argued, every cross-examination she delivered, came against the weight of skepticism not simply about her case, but about her. In those early days, she was often underestimated. Colleagues whispered about the young black woman attorney as if her presence in the courtroom were a novelty. Judges raised eyebrows. Opponents tested her patience, and clients sometimes looked surprised when she walked in. But Crockett learned fast. She discovered that surviving in hostile spaces was not just about speaking loudly. It was about speaking precisely, calmly, cutting through noise with truth that could not be ignored. And so she developed her style. Deliberate pauses that disarmed interruptions, piercing questions that exposed contradictions, and a composure that unsettled those who expected fluster. In court, she didn't meet hostility with hostility. She met it with something far stronger: restraint, sharpened into power. That discipline carried her into politics, where the stakes grew larger and the hostility even sharper. As a congresswoman, Crockett entered hearings where the imbalance of power was obvious, where established figures wielded decades of authority, and where the voices of women of color were too often sidelined or dismissed. Yet Crockett never abandoned the lessons of those Texas courtrooms. She knew that every sneer from across the table, every sarcastic jab, every patronizing smirk was not just aimed at her, was aimed at the communities she represented. And for her, that meant silence was not an option. Her calm was not a performance. It was lived resilience. She carried into those chambers the weight of countless people who had been mocked for their accents, their backgrounds, their identities. When she spoke, she wasn't simply offering arguments, she was voicing survival. Her pauses weren't hesitation. They were echoes of all the times people like her had been told to wait their turn, only now transformed into weapons of control. What set Crockett apart was her refusal to let others define the rules of engagement. In an arena built on shouting matches and interruptions, she redefined strength as composure. Where others raised their voices, she lowered hers, forcing the room to lean in. Where others sneered, she answered with precision. Where others tried to drown her out, she let silence stretch long enough to make their mockery sound juvenile. That style, grounded in lived truth, became her armor. And it was more than personal. It was generational. Crockett stood for the people who had been laughed out of hearings, cut off in boardrooms, ignored in classrooms. Each time she held her ground, she held it for them. Each time she refused to be rattled, she rewrote the script that so many before her had been forced to follow. Her rise to Congress was not an accident, or a gift. It was the result of years of carving space in places that weren't built for her. And with that rise came a new stage. Televised hearings where millions could watch the very contrast that defined her career. The old guard, armed with condescension, facing off against a new kind of leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. Her strength was not the strength of volume. It was the strength of endurance, of holding her dignity in spaces designed to strip it away, of meeting every insult with clarity, every dismissal with evidence, every sneer with calm that unnerved the arrogant. And yet, Crockett understood the stakes extended far beyond her own name. Each time she sat at that long wooden table in the House chamber, she knew her calm carried more than personal pride. It carried the dignity of communities who had been silenced for generations. It carried the voices of women, of immigrants, of the marginalized who had been told their stories were less valuable. Crockett's composure was not just her own survival, it was survival turned into strength for others. That was why every clash mattered. Because every time someone tried to mock her, the world was watching to see if the old script would play out again. Would the woman of color be talked over, laughed at, sidelined? Or would she hold steady, rewriting the narrative in real time? This was Jasmine Crockett's gift. Her presence wasn't just defiance of history, it was the embodiment of change. She was proof that dignity, once dismissed as weakness, was in fact a sharper weapon than arrogance could ever be. And in this story, that weapon was about to be tested again. Ron Johnson had walked into the hearing armed with mockery, the smirk that had carried him through countless controversies. He believed his sneer would overshadow her voice, the way it had overshadowed so many others. But Johnson had never met someone quite like Crockett, someone who knew that true power doesn't scream at steadies. And that strength was about to face Johnson's mockery in the harshest spotlight yet. The hearing room was already tense, but the moment Ron Johnson leaned forward, his voice slicing the air with casual cruelty, the temperature shifted. He didn't just challenge Jasmine Crockett's argument, he belittled her very background. With a sneer curling his lips, he questioned her experience, his tone thick with condescension, as though her presence at the table was some kind of accident. The words weren't subtle. They were designed to sting, aimed not at her record, not at her reasoning, but at the foundation of who she was. He mocked the trajectory from a Texas courtroom to the halls of Congress, suggesting that her so-called expertise paled next to his years in the Senate. It was the kind of insult meant to elicit outrage, to bait her into losing composure in front of the cameras. But Crockett didn't take the bait. She sat motionless, her posture straight, her gaze steady, her hands resting calmly in front of her. She let him talk. She let him twist his smirk into a grin, let him raise his voice with each jab, let him pile insult on insult as though the weight of his words could break her silence. The room reacted in waves. On one side, a few chuckles rose, aides and allies smirking, along with Johnson's ridicule. On the other, jaws tightened, eyes darted toward Crockett, waiting, almost willing her to respond. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, cameras zoomed in close enough to capture the tension in her face. The silence around her was deafening, but it was not empty. It was charged. Johnson, mistaking that silence for weakness, leaned back in his chair. He stretched his arms across the table with a satisfaction that filled the chamber. His smile widened. He believed he had one. He believed that by framing Crockett as inexperienced, unworthy, and out of place, he had sealed the narrative. But those who knew Crockett understood what was coming. They recognized the glint in her eye, the way her composure wasn't surrendered but preparation. Each second of her silence was deliberate. Each pause tightened the rope of tension, pulling the audience further to the edge of their seats. The longer she waited, the more Johnson's confidence seemed to inflate. He smirked at his colleagues as if to say, "See? She has nothing." He reveled in the assumption that his authority could silence her. The chamber itself seemed to split. Half of it leaned toward Johnson's bravado, emboldened by the spectacle. The other half leaned toward Crockett's stillness, holding their breath for the storm they sensed gathering behind her calm. It was a duel of contrasts, playing out in real time. Arrogance puffed up against restraint sharpened into power. And then came the pause, long enough for the room to grow restless, long enough for the smirks to spread, long enough for the cameras to record the full display of Johnson's smug satisfaction. The silence was its own kind of theater, and everyone was in the audience now. And then, just as Johnson leaned back in smug satisfaction, Crockett finally spoke. The moment Ron Johnson leaned back, smirk spread wide, the room seemed to hold its breath. For a heartbeat, silence wrapped itself around Jasmine Crockett like armor. And then finally she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her tone to match his. She simply began, each word chosen like a stone placed with precision, building something solid where Johnson had tried to scatter dust. "Senator," she said, pausing long enough for the weight of the address to land, "you mock my background as though it's something to be ashamed of. But my background is exactly why I am here, and exactly why so many Americans trust me to sit at this table." The smirks faltered. Reporters' pens froze mid-stroke. Camera zoomed in, catching the spark in her eyes. She continued, her cadence deliberate, unshaken. I wasn't born into privilege. I didn't inherit power. I earned my way into every courtroom, every fight for justice, and every step that brought me to Congress. You call that inexperience. I call it perseverance. The room shifted. What Johnson had cast as a weakness, she was reframing as strength. Each line was a reversal, a reclamation, a blade turned back on the hand that swung it. She didn't stop there. Crockett leaned in, her voice still calm, but now layered with the weight of history. She continued, her cadence deliberate, unshaken. I wasn't born into privilege. I didn't inherit power. I earned my way into every courtroom, every fight for justice, and every step that brought me to Congress. You call that inexperience. I call it perseverance. The room shifted. What Johnson had cast as a weakness, she was reframing as strength. Each line was a reversal, a reclamation, a blade turned back on the hand that swung it. She didn't stop there. Crockett leaned in, her voice still calm but now layered with the weight of history. When I defended clients in Texas, people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, people who were dismissed by a system stacked against them, I learned something you can't learn from privilege. I learned resilience. I learned to stand when everything around me said, sit down. And I learned that dignity is louder than any insult. The chamber grew quieter with every sentence. Johnson shifted in his seat, his smirk tightening into something thinner, harder. He tapped his fingers on the desk, then cleared his throat, as though preparing to cut in. But Crockett didn't flinch. She pressed forward, weaving history into her truth. When women of color are told they don't belong, when immigrants are told their voices don't matter, when working families are told they should accept scraps while the powerful hoard wealth, those aren't just insults. They're weapons. And I've spent my life refusing to be silent in the face of them. Gasps rippled across the chamber. A few heads nodded, subtle but unmistakable. The tide was shifting. Johnson leaned forward, trying to interrupt, his voice rising. That's not, but the room didn't hear him. The microphones picked up Crockett's voice, her calm precision drowning out his attempt. Her cadence had locked in. She owned the space. You say my background makes me unqualified, she said, refusing to look his way. But my background is exactly what qualifies me to recognize the games being played here. I've seen how mockery is used to silence people. I've seen how arrogance disguises itself as authority, and I've seen how quickly that facade crumbles when it's challenged by truth. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged, as though every ear in the chamber leaned toward her words. Johnson's composure cracked, his jaw clenched, his face flushed, and he tried again to interject, voice louder this time. You're grandstanding. This is again, her voice cut through calm, but immovable. No, Senator. This is not grandstanding. This is clarity. And clarity doesn't need to shout. The line landed like a hammer. Reporters' eyes widened. Some scribbled furiously. Staffers exchanged glances. The contrast between Johnson's rising volume and Crockett's steady calm was no longer a duel, it was a rout. She pressed further, every phrase sharper than the last. You represent arrogance. I represent resilience. You use mockery. I use truth. And in the end, only one of those will endure. Her words built, brick by brick, into something unshakable. America's story isn't written by those who sneer from high chairs of privilege. It's written by those who rise from the ground, carry their communities, and refuse to be silenced. That is my background. That is my service. And that is why your insults mean nothing. Johnson sat rigid now, his smug veneer collapsing. He shifted in his chair, his eyes darting to colleagues, searching for support that wasn't there. Crockett, without raising her voice, delivered the final blow. So mock me if you must, Senator. But remember this. History never remembers the mockers. It remembers the ones who endure. The chamber erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned, reverent silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a verdict, the kind that carries more weight than any noise. Johnson's face turned crimson. His jaw worked, but no words came out. He pushed back his chair abruptly, the scrape echoing through the hearing room like an admission of defeat. Without another word, he stood, stiff and furious, and walked out. Cameras caught everything: the red face, the stiff shoulders, the hurried exit. Reporters scribbled, lenses followed, and the sound of his footsteps became the punctuation mark on his own unraveling. Jasmine Crockett remained seated, composed, her hands folded neatly on the table. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't moved more than an inch, but she had shifted the ground beneath him. The room buzzed, whispers colliding with the weight of what had just unfolded. Staffers leaned in, exchanging urgent glances. Reporters mouthed words like viral and explosive. It was as if everyone knew, in real time, that they were watching a moment destined to ricochet far beyond the walls of that chamber. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Arrogance storming out, dignity sitting still. And as the door closed behind Ron Johnson, Crockett's calm presence remained, filling the void he had left behind. But the real explosion wasn't in that chamber. It was about to detonate across America. It took less than an hour for the moment to spill beyond the hearing room and flood every corner of the internet. The clip Jansen's sneering, Crockett's calm reply, the silence that followed, and his abrupt walkout hit social media like lightning. Within minutes, hashtags began to surge: hashtag Crockett.com, hashtag Johnson walkout, hashtag dignity over mockery. On Twitter. The footage was clipped, captioned, and shared at dizzying speed. One post read, "This is what grace under fire looks like." Senator Johnson folded like a cheap suit. Another simply showed a side-by-side, Johnson's red face frozen mid-sneer, next to Crockett's serene gaze with the caption, "Noise versus truth." TikTok creators wasted no time. Remixes exploded. Crockett's line, "Clarity doesn't need to shout," was set to dramatic music. Looped over slow-motion shots of Johnson storming out. Memes took over Instagram. GIFs of the walkout spliced with captions like, "When the group chat calls you out, and you got nothing left to what you say." What could have been a fleeting political spat had transformed into cultural shorthand. Calm composure became a symbol. Loud arrogance became a punchline. Cable news shows replayed the footage on a loop, analysts dissecting every second. On MSNBC, one commentator declared, "This was bigger than an exchange. It was a power shift." A woman of color turned mockery into dignity, and a sitting senator couldn't handle it. On CNN, the framing was blunt. Johnson lost the room. Crockett owned it. Even Fox News struggled to spin it. Some anchors dismissed it as grandstanding, but their clips drew more ridicule than support. Comment sections filled with viewers asking why Johnson, supposedly the powerful one in the room, had been the first to crack and leave. Then came late-night television. Stephen Colbert opened with a parody, Johnson stomping out, complete with cartoon sound effects, followed by a fake voiceover, "When you lose the argument. Just rage quit." Trevor Noah called it the political version of flipping the Monopoly board when you're losing. Laughter echoed across living rooms nationwide, sealing Johnson's exit as comedy gold, but not all the reactions were laughter. Some were odd clips of Crockett's calm stare circulated with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." Young activists shared her words as motivational reels. History never remembers the mockers. It remembers the ones who endure. The phrase began to appear on protest signs, memes, even t-shirts for sale on Etsy. For many, the viral moment tapped into something deeper than partisan bickering. It felt like a cultural reckoning, mockery as a tool of power meeting its limit against dignity. Communities long dismissed or belittled saw themselves reflected in Crockett's poise. For them, this wasn't just political theater. It was representation. Interviews flooded in. College students posted reaction videos. "This is the kind of composure I want to have when someone tries to belittle me," parents tweeted. "I showed my daughter this clip. She said she looks like me. She's inspired." Johnson, meanwhile, became a meme not of strength, but of retreat. Headlines called it the walkout heard around Washington. Editorial cartoons depicted him slamming the door on himself. His attempt at mockery had backfired so profoundly that his name trended not for authority, but for defeat. Political strategists began weighing in. One noted, "Moments like this shift narratives. Crockett didn't just win the exchange, she owned the story. And in politics, story is power." The symbolism grew heavier as the week wore on. Civil rights leaders praised Crockett's calm as an extension of a long tradition of resilience in the face of taunts. Commentators connected her composure to larger cultural battles about who gets to be heard, who gets to define dignity, who walks away, and who stays seated in truth. It wasn't just Crockett's words. It was the image. Side by side, Johnson storming out while she remained still became an instant political tableau. Some compared it to earlier iconic moments in American history, leaders facing down hostility not with rage, but with stillness that exposed the fragility of power. And yet, beneath the laughter, the memes, the hashtags, something deeper stirred. Social media may have turned it into comedy gold, but to millions, the question beneath it pulsed, louder than the punchlines. Who truly holds power in America? The ones who mock and storm out, or the ones who endure with calm clarity? The answer was no longer rhetorical. It was the cliffhanger that would define what came next. Yet beneath the laughter, something deeper stirred, a question about power, dignity, and America's future. When the dust settled, Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't replay Johnson's humiliation or revel in his exit. Instead, she reframed the entire encounter with a clarity that cut deeper than any insult. It was never about humiliating him, she explained in a later interview. It was about showing that mockery doesn't define truth. Those words reverberated as powerfully as the viral clip itself. They stripped the drama down to its essence. This was not a story of one person embarrassing another. It was about something bigger, something more enduring, the power of dignity against the noise of derision. In that moment, Crockett turned a clash into a lesson. Johnson had mocked her background, sneered at her experience, and tried to turn her into a caricature. But instead of reacting with anger, she leaned on calm and restraint. And by doing so, she reminded millions watching that America's true strength is not found in who can shout the loudest, but in who can stand firm without breaking. The contrast was almost too sharp to ignore. Johnson exited in frustration, his face red, his authority leaking away with every hurried step out of the chamber. Crockett stayed. She remained seated, steady, her presence unshaken. One fled. One endured. And that image, walkout versus stillness, became the story America carried forward. Insults fade, Crockett said softly. Dignity endures. It was more than a clever line. It was a truth born from generations who had endured far worse than jeers in a Senate hearing. For many communities, immigrants, women, people of color, her words captured a lived reality. Mockery had always been a weapon used to keep them small. But dignity had always been their shield. Her composure became symbolic of a broader struggle for respect in American democracy. In an age when politics often rewards those who shout, interrupt, and sneer, Crockett showed that there is another kind of power, quieter, but stronger. A power rooted in patience, truth, and the refusal to bow to arrogance. The hearing that day became more than a clash between two figures. It became a mirror for America. On one side, the sneer, the mockery, the walkout. On the other, the calm, the resilience, the staying power of dignity. Which side would the nation choose? Commentators called it a generational shift. For too long, politics has celebrated volume as strength, one wrote. Crockett reminded us that silence can be sharper, and dignity can be louder than any insult. Her message resonated far beyond Washington. College campuses, community centers, and living rooms buzzed with discussion. Parents shared the clip with their children, saying, "This is how you respond when someone tries to tear you down." Teachers replayed it in classrooms as an example of restraint under pressure. Activists pointed to it as proof that dignity, when wielded with precision, can outlast mockery every time. And yet, even as America laughed at Johnson's retreat and celebrated Crockett's composure, a deeper question lingered in the silence he left behind. who truly defines this country's voice? Is it the ones who storm out when challenged, or the ones who sit still and let truth speak for itself? That question pierced through the noise. It turned the viral moment into something more than entertainment. It became a reckoning. A test not of who won the hearing, but of what kind of nation America wants to be, and millions watching were left with a single piercing question. Who really speaks for America? Asterisk, Ron Johnson mocked. Jasmine Crockett endured, and America witnessed every second of it. What started as a sneer meant to belittle turned into a lesson the nation couldn't ignore. When arrogance walks out, dignity remains seated, steady, unbroken. If you felt pride watching her calm under fire, you weren't alone. Across the country, people replayed that moment not just for the drama, but for the validation it carried. It told millions who have been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated that composure can be the sharpest response. That silence, when held with strength, can roar louder than the most cutting insult. And that's why this story matters. It wasn't about a single exchange in a congressional hearing. It was about whose story America chooses to elevate: the story of mockery and retreat, the story of resilience and presence. On that day, the answer was clear. Now it's our turn to carry that answer forward. If you believe that dignity is stronger than arrogance, that truth stands taller than sneers, that voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be heard, then this is your moment to act. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to see it. Be part of a community that doesn't just watch politics happen, but claims pride in the leaders who embody composure, truth, and strength. Because this wasn't just a clash in Congress, it was a reminder of what America's voice truly sounds like: calm, steady, unshaken, and unwilling to be silenced. The question now is simple. Will you let that voice echo louder by standing with it? Join us, share, subscribe. Let's make dignity go viral.